O Sieves of Caladan, O people of Duke Leto, citadel of Leto fallen, fallen forever, from Songs of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. Paul felt that all his past, every experience before this night, had become sand curling in an hourglass. He sat near his mother, hugging his knees within a small fabric and plastic hutment, a still tent, that had come, like the Fremen clothing they now wore, from the pack left in the Fopter. There was no doubt in Paul's mind who had put the Frem kit there, who had directed the course of the Fopter carrying them captive. Hewer. The traitor doctor had sent them directly to the hands of Duncan Idaho. Paul stared out the transparent end of the still tent at the moon-shadowed rocks that ringed this place where Duncan had hidden them. Hiding like a child when I'm now the Duke, Paul thought. He felt the thought gall him, but could not deny the wisdom in what they did. Something had happened to his awareness this night. He saw with sharpened clarity every circumstance and occurrence around him. He felt unable to stop the inflow of data or the cold precision with which each new item was added to his knowledge, and the computation was centered in his awareness. It was mentat power and more. Paul thought back to the moment of impotent rage as the strange Fopter dived out of the night onto them, stooping like a giant hawk above the desert with wind screaming through its wings. The thing in Paul's mind had happened to them. The Fopter had skidded and slewed across a sand ridge toward the running figures, his mother and himself. Paul remembered how the smell of burned sulphur from abrasion of Fopter skids against sand had drifted across them. His mother, he knew, had turned, expected to meet a lasgun in the hands of Harkonnen mercenaries, and had recognized Duncan Idaho leaning out the Fopter's open door, shouting, "Hurry! There's worm sign south of you." But Paul had known as he turned who piloted the Fopter, an accumulation of minutiae in the way it was flown, the dash of the landing, clues so small even his mother hadn't detected them, had told Paul precisely who sat at those controls. Across the still tent from Paul, Jessica stirred, said, "There can be only one explanation. The Harkonnens held you as wife. He hated the Harkonnens. I cannot be wrong about that." He read his note. But why has he saved us from the carnage? She is only now seeing it in that poorly, Paul thought. The thought was a shock. He had known this fact as a by-the-way thing while reading the note that had accompanied the ducal signet in the pack. "Do not try to forgive me," Yui had written. "I do not want your forgiveness. I already have enough burdens. What I have done was done without malice or hope of another's understanding. It was my own Dahadi al-Burhan, my ultimate test. I give you the Atreides ducal signet as a token that I write truly. By the time you read this, Duke Leto will be dead. Take consolation from my assurance that he did not die alone. That one we hate above all others died with him." It had not been addressed or signed, but there had been no mistaking the familiar scrawl. U.S. Remembering the letter, Paul re-experienced the distress of that moment. A thing sharp and strange that seemed to happen outside his new mental alertness. He had read that his father was dead, known the truth of the words, but had felt them as no more than another datum to be entered in his mind and used. I loved my father, Paul thought, and knew this for truth. I should mourn him. I should feel something. But he felt nothing except, here's an important fact. It was one of all the other facts. All the while his mind was adding some sense impressions, extrapolating, computing. Halleck's words came back to Paul. Mood's a thing for cattle or for making love. You fight when the necessity arises, no matter your mood. Perhaps that's it, Paul thought. I'll mourn my father later, when there's time. But he felt no let-up in the cold precision of his being. He sensed that his new awareness was only a beginning, that it was growing. The sense of terrible purpose he'd first experienced in his ordeal with the Reverend Mother Goddess Helen Mohiam pervaded him. His right hand, the hand of remembered pain, tingled and throbbed. Is this what it is to be their Kwisatz Haderach? He wondered. For a while, I thought Howard had failed us again, Jessica said. I thought perhaps you wasn't a Sook, Doctor. He was everything we thought him, and more, Paul said. And he thought, why is she so slow seeing these things? He said. If Idaho doesn't get through to Kynes, we'll be... He's not our only hope, she said. Such was not my suggestion, he said. She heard the steel in his voice, the sense of command, and stared across the grey darkness of the still tent at him. Paul was a silhouette against moon-frosted rocks seen through the tent's transparent end. Others among your father's men will have escaped, she said. We must regather them. Fine, we will depend upon ourselves, he said. Our immediate concern is our family atomics. We must get them before the Harkonnens can search them out. Not likely they'll be found, she said, the way they were hidden. It must not be left to chance. And she thought, blackmail with the family atomics as a threat to the planet and its spice. That's what he has in mind, but all he can hope for them is escape into renegade anonymity. His mother's words had provoked another train of thought in Paul, a duke's concern for all the people they'd lost this night. People are the true strength of a great house, Paul thought, and he remembered Hart's words. Parting with people is a sadness. A place is only a place. They're using Sardaukar, Jessica said. We must wait until the Sardaukar have been withdrawn. They think us caught between the desert and the Sardaukar, Paul said. They intend that there be no Atreides survivors. Total extermination. Do not count on any of our people escaping. They cannot go on indefinitely risking exposure of the Emperor's part in this. Can't they? Some of our people are bound to escape. Are they? Jessica turned away, frightened of the bitter strength in her son's voice, hearing the precise assessment of chances. She sensed that his mind had leaped ahead of her, but it now saw more in some respects than she did. She had helped train the intelligence which did this, but now she found herself fearful of it. Her thoughts turned, seeking toward the lost sanctuary of her duke, and tears burned her eyes. This is the way it had to be, Leto, she thought. A time of love and a time of grief. She rested her hand on her abdomen, awareness focused on the embryo there. I have the Atreides daughter I was ordered to produce, but the Reverend Mother was wrong. A daughter wouldn't have saved my Leto. This child is only life reaching for the future in the midst of death. I conceived out of instinct and not out of obedience. Try the communinet receiver again, Paul said. The mind goes on working no matter how we try to hold it back, she thought. Jessica found the tiny receiver Idaho had left for them, flipped its switch. A green light glowed on the instrument's face. Teeny screeching came from its speaker. She reduced the volume, hunted across the bands. A voice speaking Atreides battle language came into the tent. Back and regroup at the ridge. Fedor reports no survivors in Carthag and the guild bank has been sacked. Carthag, Jessica thought. That was a Harkonnen hotbed. They're Sardaukar, the voice said. Watch out for Sardaukar and Atreides uniforms. There, a roaring filled the speaker, then silence. Try the other bands, Paul said. Do you realize what that means? Jessica asked. I expected it. They want the guild to blame us for the destruction of their bank. With the guild against us, we're trapped on Arrakis. Try the other bands. She weighed his words. I expected it. What had happened to him? Slowly, Jessica returned to the instrument. As she moved the band slide, they caught glimpses of violence and the few voices calling out in Atreides battle language. Fall back. Try to regroup, Ad. Trapped in a cave, Ad. There was no mistaking the victorious exultation in the Harkonnen gibberish that poured from the other bands. Sharp commands, battle reports. That wasn't enough of it for Jessica to register and break the language, but the tone was obvious. Harkonnen victory. Paul shook the pack beside him, hearing the 2-liter juns of water gurgle there. He took a deep breath, looked up through the transparent end of the tent at the rock escarpment outlined against the stars. His left hand felt the sphincter seal of the tent's entrance. It'll be dawn soon, he said. We can wait through the day for Idaho, but not for another night. In the desert, you must travel by night and rest in shade through the day. Remembered law insinuated itself into Jessica's mind. Without a stillsuit, a man sitting in shade on the desert needs 5 liters of water a day to maintain body weight. She felt the slick, soft skin of the stillsuit against her body, thinking how their lives depended on these garments. If we leave here, Idaho can't find us, she said. There are ways to make any man talk, he said. If Idaho hasn't returned by dawn, we must consider the possibility he has been captured. How long do you think he could hold out? The question required no answer, and she sat in silence. Paul lifted the seal on the pack, pulled out a tiny micro-manual with glow tab and magnifier. Green and orange letters leaped up at him from the pages. Leader John's still tent, energy caps, recaps, sand snork, binoculars, still suit rep kit, Barrett eye pistol, sync chart, lilt plugs, paracompass, maker hooks, thumpers, frem kit, fire pillar. So many things for survival on the desert. Presently he put the manual aside on the tent floor. Where can we possibly go? Jessica asked. My father spoke of desert power, Paul said. The Harkonnens cannot rule this planet without it. They've never ruled this planet, nor shall they. Not even with 10,000 legions of Sardaukar. Paul, you can't think that, with all the evidence in our hands, he said. Right here in this tent, the tent itself, this pack and its contents, these still suits. We know the Guild wants a prohibitive price for weather satellites. We know that. What have weather satellites to do with it? She asked. They couldn't possibly... She broke off. Paul sensed the hyper-alertness of his mind, reading her reactions, computating on minutiae. You see it now, he said. The satellites watch the terrain below. There are things in the deep desert that will not bear frequent inspection. It was suggesting the Guild itself controls this planet? She was so slow. No, he said. The Fremen. They're paying the Guild for privacy, paying in a coin that's freely available to anyone with desert power. Spice. This is more than a second approximation answer. It's a straight-line computation. Depend on it. Paul, Jessica said, You're not a mentat yet. You can't know for sure how. I'll never be a mentat, he said. I'm something else. A freak. Paul, how can you say such? Leave me alone. He turned away from her, looking out into the night. Why can't I mourn? He wondered. He felt that every fibre of his being craved this release, but it would be denied him forever. Jessica had never heard such distress in her son's voice. She wanted to reach out to him, hold him, comfort him, help him, but she sensed there was nothing she could do. He had to solve this problem by himself. The glowing tab of the Fremkit manual between them on the 10th floor caught her eye. She lifted it, glanced at the flyleaf, reading, Manual of the Friendly Desert, the place full of life. Here are the Ayat and Burhan of life. Believe, and Allah shall never burn you. It reads like the AODiobook, she thought, recalling her studies of the great secrets. Has a manipulator of religions been on Arrakis? Paul lifted the power compass from the pack, returned it, said, Think of all these special application Fremen machines. They show unrivaled sophistication. Admit it, the culture that made these things betrays depths no one suspected. Hesitating, still worried by the harshness in his voice, Jessica returned to the book, studied an illustrated constellation from the Arrakeen sky. Muad'Dib, the mouse, and noted that the tail pointed north. Paul stared into the tense darkness at the dimly discerned movements of his mother revealed by the manual's glow tab. Now is the time to carry out my father's wish, he thought. I must give her his message while she has time for grief. Grief would inconvenience us later. And he found himself shocked by precise logic. Mother, he said. Yes? She heard the change in his voice, felt coldness in her entrails at the sound. Never had she heard such harsh control. My father is dead, he said. She searching within herself for the coupling of fact and fact and fact. The Bene Gesserit way of assessing data, and it came to her. The sensation of terrifying loss. Jessica nodded, unable to speak. My father charged me once, Paul said, to give you a message if anything happened to him. He feared you might believe he distrusted you. That useless suspicion, she thought. He wanted you to know that he never suspected you, Paul said, and explained the deception, adding, He wanted you to know he always trusted you completely, always loved you, and cherished you. He said he would sooner have mistrusted himself, and he had but one regret, but he'd never made you his Duchess. She brushed the tears coursing down her cheeks, thought, what a stupid waste of the body's water. But she knew this thought for what it was, the attempt to retreat from grief into anger. Leto, my Leto, she thought, what terrible things we do to those we love. With a violent motion she extinguished the little manual's glow tab. Sobs shook her. Paul heard his mother's grief and felt the emptiness within himself. I have no grief, he thought. Why? Why? He felt the inability to grieve as a terrible flaw. A time to get and a time to lose, Jessica thought, quoting to herself from the OC Bible. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time for love and a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. Paul's mind had gone on in its chilling precision. He saw the avenues ahead of them on this hostile planet. Without even the safety valve of dreaming, he focused his prescient awareness, seeing it as a computation of most probable futures, but with something more, an edge of mystery, as though his mind dipped into some timeless stratum and sampled the winds of the future. Abruptly, as though he had found a necessary key, Paul's mind climbed another notch in awareness. He found himself clinging to this new level, clutching at a precarious hold and peering about it. It was as though he existed within a globe with avenues radiating away in all directions. Yet this only approximated the sensation. He remembered once seeing a gauze kerchief blowing in the wind, and now he sensed the future as though it twisted across some surface as undulant and impermanent as that of the wind-blown kerchief. He saw people. He felt the heat and cold of uncounted probabilities. He knew names and places, experienced emotions without number, reviewed data of innumerable unexplored crannies. There was time to probe and test and taste, but no time to shape. The thing was a spectrum of possibilities from the most remote past to the remote future, from the most probable to the most improbable. He saw his own death in countless ways. He saw new planets, new cultures, people. He saw them in such swarms they could not be listed, yet his mind catalogued them, even the guildsmen, and he thought, the guild, there'd be a way for us, my strangeness accepted as a familiar thing of high value, always with an assured supply of the now necessary spice. But the idea of living out his life in the mind groping ahead through possible futures that guided hurtling spaceships appalled him. It was a way, though, and in meeting the possible future that contained guildsmen he recognized his own strangeness. I have another kind of sight. I see another kind of terrain. The available paths. The awareness conveyed both reassurance and alarm. So many places on that other kind of terrain dipped or turned out of his sight. As swiftly as it had come, the sensation slipped away from him, and he realized the entire experience had taken the space of a heartbeat. Yet his own personal awareness had been turned over, illuminated in a terrifying way. He stared around him. Night still covered the still tent within its rock-enclosed hideaway. His mother's grief could still be heard. His own lack of grief could still be felt, that hollow place somewhere separated from his mind, which went on in its steady pace, dealing with data, evaluating, computing, submitting answers in something like the Mentat way. Now he saw that he had a wealth of data few such minds ever before had encompassed. But this made the empty place within him no easier to bear. He felt that something must shatter. It was as though a clockwork control for a bomb had been set to ticking within him. It went about its business no matter what he wanted. It recorded minuscule shadings of difference around him, a slight change in moisture, a fractional fall in temperature, the progress of an insect across their still tent roof, the solemn approach of dawn in the starlight patch of sky he could see out, the tent's transparent end. The emptiness was unbearable. Knowing how the clockwork had been set in motion made no difference. He could look to his own past and see the start of it, the training, the sharpening of talents, the refined pressures of sophisticated disciplines, even exposure to the OC Bible at a critical moment, and lastly, the heavy intake of spice. And he could look ahead, the most terrifying direction, to see where it all pointed. "I am a monster," he thought. "A freak." "No," he said. Then, "No, no, no!" He found that he was pounding the tent floor with his fists. The implacable part of him recorded this as an interesting emotional datum and fed it into computation. "Paul!" His mother was beside him, holding his hands, her face a grey blob peering at him. "Paul, what's wrong?" "You!" he said. "I'm here, Paul," she said. "It's all right." "What have you done to me?" he demanded. In a burst of clarity, she sensed some of the roots in the question, said, "I gave birth to you." It was, from instinct as much as her own subtle knowledge, the precisely correct answer to calm him. He felt her hands holding him, focused on the dim outline of her face. Certain gene traces in her facial structure were noted in the new way by his onflowing mind, the clues added to other data, and a final summation answer put forward. "Let go of me," he said. She heard the iron in his voice, obeyed. "Do you want to tell me what's wrong, Paul?" "Did you know what you were doing when you trained me?" he asked. There's no more childhood in his voice, she thought. And she said, "I hope the thing any parent hopes, that you'd be superior, different." "Different?" She heard the bitterness in his tone, said, "Paul, you didn't want a son," he said. "You wanted a Kwisatz Haderach. You wanted a male B'nai Gesserit." She recoiled from his bitterness. "But, Paul, did you ever consult my father in this?" She spoke gently out of the freshness of her grief. "Whatever you are, Paul, the heredity is as much your father as me, but not the training," he said, "not the things that awakened the sleeper." "Sleeper? It's here." He put a hand on his head and then to his breast. "It's me. It goes on and on and on and on and... Paul!" She had heard the hysteria edging his voice. "Listen to me," he said. "You wanted the Reverend Mother to hear about my dreams? You listen in her place now. I've just had a waking dream. Do you know why? You must calm yourself," she said. "If there's the spice," he said, "it's in everything here. The air, the soil, the food, the geriatric spice. It's like the truth-sayer drug. It's a poison." She stiffened. His voice lowered and he repeated, "A poison, so subtle, so insidious, so irreversible. It won't even kill you unless you stop taking it. We can't leave Arrakis unless we take part of Arrakis with us." The terrifying presence of his voice brooked no dispute. "You and the spice," Paul said. "The spice changes anyone who gets this much of it, but thanks to you, I could bring the change to consciousness. I don't get to leave it in the unconscious where its disturbance can be blanked out. I can see it. Paul, I see it," he repeated. She heard madness in his voice. She didn't know what to do. But he spoke again, and she heard the iron control return to him. We're trapped here," she agreed, and she accepted the truth of his words. No pressure of the B'nai Gesserit, no trickery or artifice could pry them completely free from Arrakis. The spice was addictive. Her body had known the fact long before her mind awakened to it. "So here we live out our lives," she thought, "on this hell planet. The place is prepared for us if we can evade the Harkonnens, and there's no doubt of my course. A broad mare preserving, an important bloodline for the B'nai Gesserit plan." "I must tell you about my waking dream," Paul said. Now there was fury in his voice. "To be sure you accept what I say, I'll tell you first that I know you'll bear a daughter, my sister, here on Arrakis." Jessica placed her hands against the tent floor, pressed back against the curving fabric wall to still a pang of fear. She knew her pregnancy could not show yet. Only her own B'nai Gesserit training had allowed her to read the first faint signals of her body, to know of the embryo only a few weeks old. "Only to serve," Jessica whispered, clinging to the B'nai Gesserit motto. "We exist only to serve." "We'll find a home among the Fremen," Paul said, "where your missionaria protectiva has brought us a bolt hole." "They've prepared a way for us in the desert," Jessica told herself, but how can he know of the missionaria protectiva? She found it increasingly difficult to subdue her terror at the overpowering strangeness in Paul. He studied the dark shadow of her, seeing her fear in every reaction of his new awareness as though she were outlined in blinding light. A beginning of compassion for her crept over him. "The things that can begin here, I cannot begin to tell you," he said. "I cannot even begin to tell myself before I have seen them. This sense of the future, I seem to have no control over it. The thing just happens. The immediate future, say a year, I can see some of that. A road as broad as our central avenue on Caladan. Some places I don't see, shadowed places, as though it went beyond a hill." And again he thought of the surface of a blowing kerchief. "And there are branchings." He fell silent as memory of that seeing filled him. No prescient dream, no experience of his life had quite prepared him for the totality with which the veil had been ripped away to reveal naked time. Recalling the experience, he recognized his own terrible purpose, the pressure of his life spreading outward like an expanding bubble, time retreating before it. Jessica found the tense glow tab control, activated it. Dim green light drove back the shadows, easing her fear. She looked at Paul's face, his eyes, the inward stare, and she knew where she had seen such a look before, pictured in records of disasters, on the faces of children who experienced starvation or terrible injury. The eyes were like pits, mouth a straight line, cheeks indrawn. It's the look of terrible awareness, she thought, someone forced to the knowledge of his own mortality. He was indeed no longer a child. The underlying impact of his words began to take over in her mind, pushing all else aside. Paul could see ahead, a way of escape for them. "There's a way to evade the Harkonnens," she said. "The Harkonnens," he sneered. "Put those twisted humans out of your mind." He stared at his mother, studying the lines of her face in the light of the glow tab. The lines betrayed her. She said, "You shouldn't refer to people as humans without—" "Don't be so sure you know where to draw the line," he said. "We carry our past with us. And mother mine, there's a thing you don't know and should. We are Harkonnens." Her mind did a terrifying thing. It blanked out as though it needed to shut off all sensation. But Paul's voice went on at that implacable pace, dragging her with it. "When next you find a mirror, study your face. Study mine now. The traces are there if you don't blind yourself. Look at my hands, the set of my bones, and if none of this convinces you, then take my word for it. I've walked the future. I've looked at a record. I've seen a place. I have all the data. We're Harkonnens." "Ah, renegade branch of the family," she said. "That's it, isn't it? Some Harkonnen cousin who—" "You're the Baron's own daughter," he said, and watched the way she pressed her hands to her mouth. The Baron sampled many pleasures in his youth, and once permitted himself to be seduced, but as for the genetic purposes of the Bene Gesserit, by one of you. The way he said "you" struck her like a slap, but it set her mind to working and she could not deny his words. So many blank ends of meaning in her past reached out now and linked. The daughter of the Bene Gesserit wanted. It wasn't to end the old Atreides Harkonnen feud, but to fix some genetic factor in their lines. What? She groped for an answer. As though he saw inside her mind, Paul said, "They thought they were reaching for me, but I'm not what they expected, and I've arrived before my time, and they don't know it." Jessica pressed her hands to her mouth. "Great Mother! He's the Kwisatz Haderach." She felt exposed and naked before him, realizing then that he saw her with eyes from which little could be hidden, and that, she knew, was the basis of her fear. "You're thinking I'm the Kwisatz Haderach," he said. "Put that out of your mind. I'm something unexpected. I must get word out to one of the schools," she thought. "The mating index may show what has happened." "They won't learn about me until it's too late," he said. She sought to divert him, lowered her hands and said, "We'll find a place among the Fremen. The Fremen have a saying they credit to Shai Hulud, Old Father Eternity," he said. "They say, be prepared to appreciate what you meet." And he thought, "Yes, mother mine, among the Fremen, you'll acquire the blue eyes and the callus beside your lovely nose from the filter tube to your still suit, and you'll bear my sister, Saint Alia of the Knife." "If you're not the Kwisatz Haderach," Jessica said. "What? You couldn't possibly know," he said. "You won't believe it until you see it." And he thought, "I'm a seed." He suddenly saw how fertile was the ground into which he had fallen, and with this realization, the terrible purpose filled him, creeping through the empty place within, threatening to choke him with grief. He had seen two main branchings along the way ahead. In one he confronted an evil old baron and said, "Hello, grandfather." The thought of that path and what lay along it sickened him. The other path held long patches of grey obscurity except for peaks of violence. He had seen a warrior religion there, a fire spreading across the universe with the Atreides green and black banner waving at the head of fanatic legions drunk on spice liquor. Gurney Halleck and a few others of his father's men, a pitiful few, were among them, all marked by the hawk symbol from the shrine of his father's skull. "I can't go that way," he muttered. "That's what the old witches of your school really want." "I don't understand you, Paul," his mother said. He remained silent, thinking like the seed he was. Thinking with the race consciousness he had first experienced as terrible purpose. He found that he no longer could hate the Bene Gesserit or the Emperor, or even the Harkonnens. They were all caught up in the need of their race to renew its scattered inheritance, to cross and mingle and infuse their bloodlines in a great new pooling of genes, and the race knew only one sure way for this, the ancient way, the tried and certain way that rolled over everything in its path. Jihad. Surely I cannot choose that way, he thought, but he saw again in his mind's eye the shrine of his father's skull and the violence with the green and black banner waving in its midst. Jessica cleared her throat, worried by his silence. Then, the Fremen will give us sanctuary? He looked up, staring across the green-lighted tent at the inbred, patrician lines of her face. Yes, he said. That's one of the ways. He nodded. Yes, they'll call me Muad'Dib, the one who points the way. Yes, that's what they'll call me. And he closed his eyes, thinking, now, my father, I can mourn you. And he felt the tears coursing down his cheeks. When my father, the Padishah Emperor, heard of Duke Leto's death and the manner of it, he went into such a rage as we had never before seen. He blamed my mother and the compact forced on him to place a Bene Gesserit on the throne. He blamed the guild and the evil old baron. He blamed everyone inside, not excepting even me, for he said I was a witch like all the others. When I sought to comfort him, saying it was done according to an older law of self-preservation to which even the most ancient rulers gave allegiance, he sneered at me and asked if I thought him a weakling. I saw then that he had been aroused to this passion not by concern over the dead duke, but by what that death implied for all royalty. And I look back on it, I think there may have been some prescience in my father too, for it is certain that his line and Muad'Dib's shared common ancestry. In my father's house by the Princess Irulan. Now Harkonnen shall kill Harkonnen, Paul whispered. He had awakened shortly before nightfall, sitting up in the sealed and darkened still tent. As he spoke, he heard the vague stirrings of his mother where she slept against the tent's opposite wall. Paul glanced at the proximity detector on the floor, studying the dials illuminated in the blackness by phosphor tubes. It should be night soon, his mother said. Why don't you lift the tent shades? Paul realized that her breathing had been different for some time, that she had lain silent in the darkness until certain he was awake. Lifting the shades wouldn't help, he said. There's been a storm. The tent's covered by sand. I'll take us out soon. No sign of Duncan yet? None. Paul rubbed absently at the ducal signet on his thumb, and a sudden rage against the very substance of this planet which had helped kill his father set him trembling. I heard the storm begin, Jessica said. The undemanding emptiness of her words helped to restore some of his calm. His mind focused on the storm as he had seen it begin through the transparent end of their still tent, cold dribbles of sand crossing the basin, then runnels and tails furrowing the sky. He had looked up to a rock spire, seen it change shape under the blast, becoming a low, cheddar-coloured wedge. Sand funneled into their basin had shadowed the sky with dull curry, then blotted out all light as the tent was covered. Tent bows had creaked once as they accepted the pressure, then silence broken only by the dim bellows wheezing of their sand snorkel pumping air from the surface. Try the receiver again, Jessica said. No use, he said. He found his still suit's water tube in its clip at his neck, drew a warm swallow into his mouth, and he thought that here he truly began an Arrakeen existence, living on reclaimed moisture from his own breath and body. It was flat and tasteless water, but it soothed his throat. Jessica heard Paul drinking, felt the slickness of her own still suit clinging to her body, but she refused to accept her first. To accept it would require awakening fully into the terrible necessities of Arrakis, where they must guard even fractional traces of moisture, hoarding the few drops in the tent's catch pockets, begrudging a breath wasted on the open air. So much easier to drift back down into sleep. But there had been a dream in this day's sleep, and she shivered at memory of it. She had held dreaming hands beneath sand floor where a name had been written, Duke Leto Atreides. The name had blurred the sand and she had moved to restore it, but the first letter filled before the last was begun. The sand would not stop. Her dream became wailing, louder and louder. That ridiculous wailing, part of her mind had realized the sound was her own voice as a tiny child, little more than a baby. A woman not quite visible to memory was going away. My unknown mother, Jessica thought, the Bene Gesserit who bore me and gave me to the sisters because that's what she was commanded to do. Was she glad to rid herself of a Harkonnen child? The place to hit them is in the spice, Paul said. How can he think of an attack at a time like this? She asked herself. An entire planet full of spice, she said. How can you hit them there? She heard him stirring, the sound of their pack being dragged across the tent floor. It was sea power and air power on Caladan, he said. Here, it's desert power. The Fremen are the key. His voice came from the vicinity of the tent sphincter. Her Bene Gesserit training sensed in his tone an unresolved bitterness toward her. All his life he's been trained to hate Harkonnens, she thought. Now he finds he is Harkonnen, because of me. How little he knows me. I was my Duke's only woman. I accepted his life and his values, even to defying my Bene Gesserit orders. The tent's glow tab came alight under Paul's hand, filled the domed area of green radiance, the domed area of green radiance. Paul crouched at the sphincter, his steel suit hood adjusted for the open desert, forehead capped, mouth filter in place, nose plugs adjusted, only his dark eyes are visible, a narrow band of face that turned once toward her and away. "Secure yourself for the open," he said, and his voice was blurred behind the filter. Jessica pulled the filter across her mouth, began adjusting her hood as she watched Paul break the tent seal. Sand rasped as he opened the sphincter, and a bird fizzle of grains ran into the tent before he could immobilize it with a static compaction tool. A hole grew in the sand wall as the tool realigned the grains. He slipped out and her ears followed his progress to the surface. What will we find out there, she wondered. Harkonnen troops of the Sardaukar? Those are dangers we can expect. What of the dangers we don't know? She thought of the compaction tool and the other strange instruments in the pack. Each of these tools was suddenly stood in her mind as a sign of mysterious dangers. She felt then a hot breeze from surface sand touch her cheeks where they were exposed above the filter. "Pass up the pack." It was Paul's voice, low and guarded. She moved to obey, heard the water leader John's gurgle as she shoved the pack across the floor. She peered upward, saw Paul framed against stars. "Here," he said, and reached down, pulled the pack to the surface. Now she saw only the circle of stars. They were like the luminous tips of weapons aimed down at her. A shower of meteors crossed her patch of night. The meteors seemed to her like a warning, like tiger stripes, like luminous grave slats clavering her blood, and she felt the chill of the price on their heads. "Hurry up," Paul said. "I want to collapse the tent." A shower of sand from the surface brushed her left hand. How much sand will the hand hold? She asked herself. "Shall I help you?" Paul asked. "No." She swallowed in the dry throat, slipped into the hole, felt static-packed sand rasp under her hands. Paul reached down, took her arm. She stood beside him on a smooth patch of starlit desert, stared around. Sand almost brimmed their basin, leaving only a dim lip of surrounding rock. She probed the further darkness with her trained senses. Noise of small animals. Birds. A fall of dislodged sand and faint creature sounds within it. Paul collapsed their tent, recovering it up the hole. Starlight displaced just enough of the night to charge each shadow with menace. She looked at patches of blackness. Black is a blind remembering, she thought. You listen for pack sounds, for the cries of those who hunted your ancestors in a past so ancient only your most primitive calls remember. The ears see, the nostrils see. Presently, Paul stood beside her, said, "Duncan told me that if he was captured he could hold out. This long. We must leave here now." He shouldered the pack, crossed to the shallow lip of the basin, climbed to a ledge that looked down on open desert. Jessica followed automatically, noting how she now lived in her son's orbit. "For now is my grief heavier than the sands of the sea," she thought. "This world has emptied me of all but the oldest purpose, tomorrow's life. I live now for my young Duke and the daughter yet to be." She felt the sand drag her feet as she climbed to Paul's side. He looked north across a line of rocks, studying a distant escarpment. The faraway rock profile was like an ancient battleship of the seas outlined by stars. The long swish of it lifted on an invisible wave with syllables of boomerang antennae, funnels arcing back, a pie-shaped upthrusting at the stern. An orange glare burst above the silhouette, and a line of brilliant purple cut downward toward the glare. Another line of purple, and another upthrusting orange glare. It was like an ancient naval battle, remembered shell fire, and the sight held them staring. "Pillars of fire," Paul whispered. A ring of red eyes lifted over the distant rock. Lines of purple laced the skies. "Jet flares and lasguns," Jessica said. The dust-reddened first moon of Arrakis lifted above the horizon to their left, and they saw a storm trail there, a ribbon of movement over the desert. "It must be Harkonnen Thopters hunting us," Paul said. "The way they're cutting up the desert. It's as though they were making certain they stamped out whatever's there. The way you'd stamp out a nest of insects. Or a nest of Atreides," Jessica said. "We must seek cover," Paul said. "We'll head south and keep to the rocks. If they caught us in the open..." He turned, adjusting the pack onto his shoulders. "They're killing anything that moves." He took one step along the ledge and, in that instant, heard the low hiss of gliding aircraft draw the dark shapes of ornithopters above them. "My father once told me that respect for the truth comes close to being the basis for all morality. Something cannot emerge from nothing," he said. "This is profound thinking if you understand how unstable the truth can be." From Conversations with Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. "I've always prided myself on seeing things the way they truly are," Fufa Hawat said. "That's the curse of being a mentat. You can't stop analysing your data. The leathered old face appeared, composed in the pre-dawn dimness as he spoke. His sappho-stained lips were drawn into a straight line of radial creases spreading upward. A robed man squatted silently on sand across from Howard, apparently unmoved by the words. The two crouched beneath a rock overhang that looked down on a wide, shallow sink. Dawn was spreading over the shadowed outline of cliffs across the basin, touching everything with pink. It was cold under the overhang, a dry and penetrating chill left over from the night. There had been a warm wind just before dawn, but now it was cold. Howard could hear teeth chattering behind him among the few troopers remaining in his force. The man squatting across from Howard was a Fremen who had come across the sink in the first light of false dawn, skittering over the sand, blending into the dunes, his movements barely discernible. The Fremen extended a finger to the sand between them, drew a figure there. It looked like a bowl with an arrow spilling out of it. "There are many Harkonnen patrols," he said. He lifted his finger, pointed upward across the cliffs that Howard and his men had descended. Howard nodded. Many patrols, yes. Still he did not know what the Fremen wanted, and this rankled. Mentat training was supposed to give the man the power to see motives, This had been the worst night of Howard's life. He had been at Simpo, a garrison village, buffer outpost for the former capital city, Carthag, when the reports of attack began arriving. At first, he'd thought, it's a raid, the Harkonnens are testing. But report followed report, faster and faster. 2 legions landed at Carthag, 5 legions, 50 brigades, attacking the Duke's main base at Arakeen, a legion at Arsant, 2 battle groups at Splintered Rock. Then the reports became more detailed. There were Imperial Sardaukar among the attackers, possibly 2 legions of them, and it became clear that the invaders knew precisely which weight of arms to send where. Precisely. Superb intelligence. Howard's shocked fury had mounted until it threatened the smooth functioning of his Mentat capabilities. The size of the attack struck his mind like a physical blow. Now hiding beneath a bit of desert rock, he nodded to himself, pulled his torn and slashed tunic around him as though warding off the cold shadows. The size of the attack. He'd always expected their enemy to hire an occasional lighter from the guild for probing raids. That was an ordinary enough gambit in this kind of house-to-house warfare. Lighters landed and took off on Arrakis regularly to transport the spice for House Atreides. Howard had taken precautions against random raids by false spice lighters, for a full attack that expected no more than 10 brigades. But there were more than 2,000 ships down on Arrakis at the last count. Not just lighters, but frigates, scouts, monitors, crushers, troop carriers, dump boxes. More than 100 brigades. 10 legions. The entire spice income of Arrakis for 50 years might just cover the cost of such a venture. It might. I underestimated what the Baron was willing to spend in attacking us, Howard thought. I failed my Duke. Then there was the matter of the traitor. I will live long enough to see her strangled, he thought. I should have killed that Bene Gesserit witch when I had the chance. There was no doubt in his mind who had betrayed them. The Lady Jessica. She fitted all the facts available. Your man Gurney Halleck and part of his force are safe with our smuggler friends, the Fremen said. Good, so Gurney will get off this hell planet. We're not all gone. Howard glanced back at the huddle of his men. He had started the night just past with 300 of his finest. Of those, and even 20 remained, and half of them were wounded. Some of them slept now, standing up, leaning against the rock, sprawled on the sand beneath the rock. Their last Vopter, the one they'd been using as a ground effect machine to carry their wounded, had given out just before dawn. They had cut it up with las guns and hidden the pieces, then worked their way down into this hiding place at the edge of the basin. Howard had only a rough idea of their location, some 200 kilometers southeast of Arakeen. The main travelled ways between the shield wall, CH communities were somewhere south of them. The Fremen across from Howard threw back his hood and stillsuit cap to reveal sandy hair and beard. The hair was combed straight back from a high, thin forehead. He had the unreadable total blue eyes of the space diet. Beard and moustache were stained at one side of the mouth, his hair matted there by pressure of the looping catch tube from his nose plugs. The man removed his plugs, readjusted them. He rubbed at a scar beside his nose. If you cross the sink here this night, the Fremen said, you must not use shields. There is a break in the wall. He turned on his heels, pointed south. There, and it is open sand down to the erg. Shields will attract he hesitated. Worm. They don't often come in here, but a shield will bring one every time. He said worm, Howard thought. He was going to say something else. What? What does he want of us? Howard sighed. He could not recall ever before being this tired. It was a muscle weariness that energy pills were unable to ease. Those damnable Sardaukar. With self-accusing bitterness, he faced the thought of the soldier fanatics and the imperial treachery they represented. His own Mentat assessment of the data told him how little chance he had ever to present evidence of this treachery before the High Council of the Landsraad, where justice might be done. Do you wish to go to the smugglers? The Fremen asked. Is it possible? The way is long. Fremen don't like to say no, Idaho had told him once. Howard said, you haven't told me whether your people can help my wounded. They are wounded. Try the same damn dancer every time. You know they're wounded, Howard snapped. That's not the peace, friend, the Fremen cautioned. What do your wounded say? Are there those among them who can see the water need of your tribe? We haven't talked about water, Howard said. I can understand your reluctance, the Fremen said. They are your friends, your tribesmen. Do you have water? Not enough. The Fremen gestured to Howard's tunic, the skin exposed beneath it. You were caught in siege, without your suits. You must make a water decision, friend. Can we hire your help? The Fremen shrugged. You have no water. He glanced at the group behind Howard. How many of your wounded would you spend? Howard fell silent, staring at the man. He could see as it meant that their communication was out of phase. Word sounds were not being linked up here in the normal manner. I am food for Howard, he said. I can speak for my Duke. I will make promissory commitment now for your help. I wish a limited form of help, preserving my force long enough to kill a traitor who thinks herself beyond vengeance. You wish our siding in the vendetta? The vendetta I'll handle myself. I wish to be freed of responsibility for my wounded, that I may get about it. The Fremen scowled. How can you be responsible for your wounded? They are their own responsibility. The water's at issue, for Howard. Would you have me take that decision away from you? The man put a hand to a weapon concealed beneath his robe. Howard hensed, wondering, is this betrayal here? What do you fear? The Fremen demanded. These people and their disconcerting directness. Howard spoke cautiously. There's a price on my head. Ah! The Fremen removed his hand from his weapon. You think we have the Byzantine corruption? You don't know us. The Harkonnens have not water enough to buy the smallest child among us. But they had the price of guild passage for more than 2,000 fighting ships, Howard thought, and the size of that price still staggered him. We both fight Harkonnens, Howard said. Should we not share the problems and ways of meeting the battle issue? We are sharing, the Fremen said. I've seen you fight Harkonnens. You are good. There have been times I'd have appreciated your arm beside me. Say where my arm may help you, Howard said. Who knows? The Fremen asked. There are Harkonnen forces everywhere, but you still have not made the water decision or put it to your wounded. I must be cautious, Howard told himself. There's a thing here that's not understood. He said, Will you show me your way, the Arakeen way? Stranger thinker, the Fremen said, and there was a sneer in his tone. He pointed to the northwest across the cliff top. We watched you come across the sand last night. He lowered his arm. You keep your force in the slip face of the dunes. Bad. You have no steel suits, no water. You will not last long. The way of Arrakis don't come easily. Howard said, Truth, but we've killed Harkonnens. What do you do if you're own wounded? Howard demanded. Does a man not know when he's worth saving? The Fremen asked. Your wounded know you have no water. He tilted his head, looking sideways up at Howard. This is clearly a time for water decision. Both wounded and unwounded must look to the tribe's future. The tribe's future, Howard thought. The tribe of Atreides. There's sense in that. He forced himself to the question he had been avoiding. Have you word of my Duke or his son? Unreadable blue eyes stared upward into Howard's. Word? Their fate, Howard snapped. Fate is the same for everyone, the Fremen said. Your Duke, it is said, has met his fate. As to the Lisan al-Gaib, his son, that is in Liet's hands. Liet has not said. I knew the answer without asking, Howard thought. He glanced back at his men. They were all awake now. They had heard. They were staring out across the sand, the realization in their expressions. There was no returning to Caladan for them, and now Arrakis was lost. Howard turned back to the Fremen. Have you heard of Duncan Idaho? He was in the great house when the shield went down, the Fremen said. This I've heard. No more. She dropped the shield and let in the Harkonnens, he thought. I was the one who sat with my back to a door. How could she do this when it meant turning against her own son? But who knows how a Bene Gesserit witch thinks, if you can call it thinking. Howard tried to swallow in a dry throat. When will you hear about the boy? We know little of what happens in Arakeen, the Fremen said. He shrugged. Who knows? You have ways of finding out? Perhaps. The Fremen rubbed at the scar beside his nose. Tell me, Fufa Howard, do you have knowledge of the big weapons the Harkonnens use? The artillery, Howard thought bitterly. Who could have guessed they'd use artillery in this day of shields? You refer to the artillery they used to trap our people in the caves, he said. I've theoretical knowledge of such explosive weapons. Any man who retreats into a cave which has only one opening deserves to die, the Fremen said. Why do you ask about these weapons? Liet wishes it. Is that what he wants from us? Howard wondered. He said, Did you come here seeking information about the big guns? Liet wished to see one of the weapons for himself. Then you should just go take one. Howard sneered. Yes, the Fremen said. We took one. We have it hidden where Stilgar can study it for Liet, and where Liet can see it for himself if he wishes, but I doubt he'll want to. The weapon is not a very good one. Poor design for Arrakis. You took one? Howard asked. It was a good fight, the Fremen said. We lost only 2 men and spilled the water from more than 100 of theirs. There was Sardaukar at every gun, Howard thought. This desert madman speaks casually of losing only 2 men against Sardaukar. We would not have lost for 2 except for those others fighting beside the Harkonnens, Fremen said. Some of those were good fighters. One of Howard's men limped forward, looked down at the squatting Fremen. Are you talking about Sardaukar? He's talking about Sardaukar, Howard said. Sardaukar, the Fremen said. There appeared to be glee in his voice. Ah, so that's what they are. This was a good night indeed. Sardaukar. Which legion? Do you know? We don't know, Howard said. Sardaukar, the Fremen mused. Yet they wear Harkonnen clothing. Is this not strange? The Emperor does not wish it known he fights against a great house, Howard said. But you know they are Sardaukar. Who am I? Howard asked bitterly. You are Fu for Howard, the man said matter-of-factly. Well, we would have learned it in time. We have sent 3 of them captive to be questioned by Liet's men. Howard's aide spoke slowly, disbelief in every word. You captured Sardaukar? Only 3 of them, the Fremen said. They fought well. If only we'd had the time to link up with the Fremen, Howard thought. It was a sour lament in his mind. If only we could have trained them and armed them. Great Mar, what a fighting force we'd have had. Perhaps you delay because of worry over the Lisan al-Gaib, the Fremen said. If he is truly the Lisan al-Gaib, harm cannot touch him. Do not spend thoughts on a matter which has not been proved. I serve the Lisan al-Gaib, Howard said. His welfare is my concern. I've pledged myself to this. You are pledged to his water? Howard glanced at his aide, who was still staring at the Fremen. Returned his attention to the squatting figure. To his water, yes. You wish to return to Arrakeen, to the place of his water? Yes, to the place of his water. Why did you not say at first it was a water matter? The Fremen stood up, seated his nose plugs firmly. Howard motioned with his head for his aide to return to the others. With a tired shrug, the man obeyed. Howard heard a low-voiced conversation arise among the men. The Fremen said, There is always a way to water. Behind Howard, a man cursed. Howard's aide called, Fufa! Arky just died. The Fremen put a fist to his ear. The bond of water. It's a sign. He stared at Howard. We have a place nearby for accepting the water. Shall I call my men? The aide returned to Howard's side, said, Fufa, a couple of the men left wives in Arrakeen. They're... Well, you know how it is at a time like this. The Fremen still held his fist to his ear. Is it the bond of water, Fufa Howard? He demanded. Howard's mind was racing. He sensed now the direction of the Fremen's words, but feared the reaction of the tired men under the rock overhang when they understood it. The bond of water, Howard said. Let our tribes be joined, the Fremen said, and he lowered his fist. As though that were the signal, 4 men slid and dropped down from the rocks above them. They darted back under the overhang, rolled the dead man in a loose robe, lifted him and began running with him along the cliff wall to the right. Spurts of dust lifted around their running feet. It was so before Howard's tired men could gather their wits. The group with the body hanging like a sack in its enfolding robe was gone around a turn in the cliff. One of Howard's men shouted, Where are they going with Arky? They're taking him to bury him, Howard said. Fremen don't bury their dead, the man barked. Don't you try any tricks on us, Fufa. We know what they do. Arky was one of... Paradise were sure for a man who died in the service of Lisan al-Gaib, the Fremen said. If it is the Lisan al-Gaib you serve, as you have said it, why raise mourning cries? The memory of one who died in this fashion will live as long as the memory of man endures. But Howard's men advanced, angry looks on their faces. One had captured a lasgun. He started to draw it. Stop right where you are, Howard barked. He fought down the sick fatigue that gripped his muscles. These people respect our dead. Customs differ, but the meaning's the same. They're going to render Arky down for his water, the man with the lasgun snarled. Is it that your men wish to attend the ceremony? The Fremen asked. He doesn't even see the problem, Howard thought. The naivety of the Fremen was frightening. They're concerned for a respected comrade, Howard said. We will treat your comrade with the same reverence we treat our own, the Fremen said. This is the bond of water. We know the rights. A man's flesh is his own. The water belongs to the tribe. Howard spoke quickly as the man with the lasgun advanced another step. Will you now help our wounded? One does not question the bond, the Fremen said. We will do for you what a tribe does for its own. First, you must get all of you suited and see to the necessities. The man with the lasgun hesitated. Howard's aide said, Are you buying help with Arky's water? Not buying, Howard said. We've joined these people. Customs differ, one of his men muttered. Howard began to relax. And they'll help us get to Arrakeen? We will kill Harkonnens, the Fremen said. He grinned. And Sardaukar. He stepped backward, cupped his hands beside his ears, and tipped his head back, listening. Presently he lowered his hands, said, "An aircraft comes. Conceal yourselves beneath the rock and remain motionless." At a gesture from Howard, his men obeyed. The Fremen took Howard's arm, pressed him back with the others. "We will fight in the time of fighting," the man said. He reached beneath his robes, brought out a small cage, lifted a creature from it. Howard recognized a tiny bat. The bat turned its head, and Howard saw its blue within blue eyes. The Fremen stroked the bat, soothing it, crooning to it. He bent over the animal's head, allowed a drop of saliva to fall from his tongue into the bat's upturned mouth. The bat stretched its wings, but remained on the Fremen's open hand. The man took a tiny tube, held it beside the bat's head, and chattered into the tube. Then, lifting the creature high, he threw it upward. The bat swooped away beside the cliff and was lost to sight. The Fremen folded the cage, thrust it beneath his robe. Again he bent his head, listening. "They quarter the high country," he said. "One wonders who they seek up there." "It's known that we retreated this direction," Howard said. "One should never presume one is the sole object of a hunt," the Fremen said. "Watch the other side of the basin. You will see a thing." Time passed. Some of Howard's men stirred, whispering. "Remain silent as frightened animals," the Fremen hissed. Howard discerned a movement near the opposite cliff. Flitting blurs of tan on tan. "My little friend carried his message," the Fremen said. "He is a good messenger, day or night. I'll be unhappy to lose that one." The movement across the sink faded away. On the entire 4 to 5 kilometre expanse of sand, nothing remained but the growing pressure of the day's heat, blurred columns of rising air. "Be most silent now," the Fremen whispered. A file of plodding figures emerged from a break in the opposite cliff, headed directly across the sink. To Howard, they appeared to be Fremen, but a curiously inept band. He counted 6 men, making heavy going of it over the dunes. The flock of ornithopter wings sounded high to the right behind Howard's group. A craft came over the cliff wall above them, and a Atreides Fopter with Harkonnen and battle colours splashed on it. The Fopter swooped toward the men crossing the sink. The group there stopped on a dune crest, waved. The Fopter circled once over them in a tight curve, came back for a dust-shrouded landing in front of the Fremen. 5 men swarmed from the Fopter, and Howard saw the dust-repellent shimmering of shields and, in their motions, the hard competence of Sardaukar. "Aye, they used their stupid shields," the Fremen beside Howard hissed. He glanced toward the open south wall of the sink. "They are Sardaukar," Howard whispered. "Good." The Sardaukar approached the waiting group of Fremen in an enclosing half-circle. Sun glinted on blades held ready. The Fremen stood in a compact group, apparently indifferent. Abruptly, the sand around the two groups sprouted Fremen. They were at the ornithopter, then in it. Where the two groups had met at the dune crest, a dust cloud partly obscured violent motion. Presently, dust settled. Only Fremen remained standing. "They left only 3 men in their Fopter," the Fremen beside Howard said. "That was fortunate. I don't believe we had to damage the craft in taking it." Behind Howard, one of his men whispered, "Those were Sardaukar." "Did you notice how well they fought?" the Fremen asked. Howard took a deep breath. He smelled the burned dust around him, felt the heat, the dryness. In a voice to match that dryness, he said, "Yes, they fought well indeed." The captured Fopter took off with a lurching flap of wings, angled upward to the south in a steep, wing-tugged climb. "So these Fremen can handle Fopters too," Howard thought. On the distant dune, a Fremen waved a square of green cloth. Once, twice. "More come," the Fremen beside Howard barked. "Be ready. I'd hoped to have us away without more inconvenience." Inconvenience, Howard thought. He saw 2 more Fopters swooping from high in the west onto an area of sand suddenly devoid of visible Fremen. Only 8 splotches of blue, the bodies of the Sardaukar and Harkonnen uniforms, remained at the scene of violence. Another Fopter glided in over the cliff wall above Howard. He drew in a sharp breath as he saw it, a big troop carrier. It flew with the slow spread wing heaviness of a full load, like a giant bird coming in to nest. In the distance, the purple finger of a lasgun beam flicked from one of the diving Fopters. It laced across the sand, raising a sharp trail of dust. "The cowards," the Fremen beside Howard rasped. The troop carrier settled toward the patch of blue-clad bodies. Its wings crept out to full reach, began the cupping action of a quick stop. Howard's attention was caught by a flash of sun on metal to the south. A Fopter plummeting there in a power dive, wings folded flat against its sides, its jets a golden flare against the dark silvered grey of the sky. It plunged like an arrow toward the troop carrier, which was unshielded because of the lasgun activity around it. Straight into the carrier the diving Fopter plunged. A flaming roar shook the basin. Rocks tumbled from the cliff walls all around. A geyser of red-orange shot skyward from the sand where the carrier and its companion Fopters had been. Everything they caught in the flame. It was the Fremen who took off in that captured Thopter, Howard thought. He deliberately sacrificed himself to get that carrier. Great mother, what are these Fremen? A reasonable exchange, said the Fremen beside Howard. There must have been 300 men in that carrier. Now he must see to their wardroom and make plans to get another aircraft. He started to step out of their rock-shadowed concealment. A rain of blue uniforms came over the cliff wall in front of him, falling in low suspense of slowness. In the flashing instant, Howard had time to see that they were Sardaukar, hard faces set in battle frenzy, that they were unshielded and each carried a knife in one hand, a stunner in the other. A thrown knife caught Howard's Fremen companion in the throat, hurling him backward, twisting face down. Howard had only time to draw his own knife before blackness of a stunner projectile felled him. Muad'Dib could indeed see the future, but you must understand the limits of his power. Think of sight. You have eyes, yet cannot see without light. If you are on the floor of a valley, you cannot see beyond your valley. Just so, Muad'Dib could not always choose to look across the mysterious terrain. He tells us that a single obscure decision of prophecy, perhaps the choice of one word over another, could change the entire aspect of the future. He tells us the vision of time is broad, but when you pass through it, time becomes a narrow door. And always he fought the temptation to choose a clear, safe course, warning that path leads ever down into stagnation. From Arrakis Awakening by the Princess Irulan. As the ornithopters glided out of the night above them, Paul grabbed his mother's arm, snapped, "Don't move." Then he saw the lead craft in the moonlight, the way its wings cupped in to break for landing, the reckless dash of the hands at the controls. "It's Idaho," he breathed. The craft and its companions settled into the basin like a covey of birds coming to nest. Idaho was out of his thopter and running toward them before the dust settled. Two figures in Fremen robes followed them. Paul recognized one, the tall, sandy-bearded Kynes. "This way," Kynes called, and he veered left. Behind Kynes, the other Fremen were throwing fabric covers over their ornithopters. The craft became a row of shallow dunes. Idaho skidded to a stop in front of Paul, saluted. "My lord, the Fremen have a temporary hiding place nearby where we—" "What about that back there?" Paul pointed to the violence above the distant cliff, the jet flares, the purple beams of las guns lacing the desert. A rare smile touched Idaho's round, placid face. "My lord?" "Sire, I've left them a little warning, sir." Clearing white light filled the desert, bright as the sun, etching their shadows onto the rock floor of the ledge. In one sweeping motion, Idaho had Paul's arm in one hand, Jessica's shoulder in the other, hurling them down off the ledge into the basin. They sprawled together in the sand as the roar of an explosion thundered over them. Its shockwave tumbled chips off the rock ledge they had vacated. Idaho sat up, brushed sand from himself. "Not the family atomics," Jessica said. "I thought you planted a shield back there," Paul said. "A big one turned to full force," Idaho said. "A lasgun beam touched it and—" He shrugged. "Subatomic fusion," Jessica said. "That's a dangerous weapon." "Not a weapon, milady. Defense. That scum will think twice before using lasguns another time." The Fremen from the ornithopters stopped above them. One called in a low voice, "We should get up the cover, friends." Paul got to his feet as Idaho helped Jessica up. "That blast will attract considerable attention, sire," Idaho said. "Sire," Paul thought. To what had such strange sound were directed at him. Sire had always been his father. He felt himself touched briefly by the powers of prescience, seeing himself infected by the wild race consciousness that was moving the human universe toward chaos. The vision left him shaken, and he allowed Idaho to guide him along the edge of the basin to a rock projection. Fremen there were opening a way down into the sand with their compaction tools. "May I take your pack, sire?" Idaho asked. It's not heavy, Duncan," Paul said. "You have no body shield," Idaho said. "Do you wish mine?" He glanced at the distant cliff. "Not likely there'll be any more lasgun activity about. Keep your shield, Duncan. Your right arm is shield enough for me." Jessica saw the way the praise took effect, how Idaho moved closer to Paul, and she thought, "Such a sure hand my son has with his people." The Fremen removed a rock plug that opened a passage down into the native basement complex of the desert. A camouflage cover was rigged for the opening. "This way," one of the Fremen said, and he led them down rock steps into darkness. Behind them, the cover blotted out the moonlight. A dim green glow came alive ahead, feeling the steps and rock walls, a turn to the left. Robed Fremen were all around them now, pressing downward. They rounded the corner, found another, down-slanting passage. It opened into a rock cave chamber. Kynes stood before them, jubber hood thrown back, the neck of his steel suit glistening in the green light. His long hair and beard were mussed. The blue eyes about whites were a darkness under heavy brows. In the moment of encounter, Kynes wondered at himself, "Why am I helping these people? It's the most dangerous thing I've ever done. It could doom me with them." Then he looked squarely at Paul, seeing the boy who had taken on the mantle of manhood, masking grief, suppressing all except the position that now must be assumed, the dukedom. And Kynes realized that in that moment that the dukedom still existed, and solely because of this youth, and this was not a thing to be taken lightly. Jessica glanced once around the chamber, registering it on her senses in the Bene Gesserit way, a laboratory, a civil place full of angles and squares in the ancient manner. This is one of the Imperial ecological testing stations my father wanted as advanced bases, Paul said. His father wanted, Kynes thought. And again Kynes wondered at himself. Am I foolish to aid these fugitives? Why am I doing it? It'd be so easy to take them now, to buy the Harkonnen trust with them. Paul followed his mother's example, gestalting the room, seeing the workbench down one side, the walls of featureless rock, instruments lined the bench, dials glowing, wide grid-X planes with fluting glass emerging from them. An ozone smell permeated the place. Some of the Fremen moved on around a concealing angle in the chamber, and new sounds started there. Machine coughs, the whinnies of spinning belts and multi-drives. Paul looked to the end of the room, saw cages with small animals in them, stacked against the wall. You've recognized this place correctly, Kynes said. For what would you use such a place, Paul Atreides? To make this planet a fit place for humans, Paul said. Perhaps that was why I helped them, Kynes thought. The machine sounds abruptly hummed away to silence. Into this void there came a thick animal squeak from the cages. It was cut off abruptly as though in embarrassment. Paul returned his attention to the cages, saw that the animals were brown-winged bats. The automatic feeder extended from the side wall across the cages. A Fremen emerged from the hidden area of the chamber, spoke to Kynes. Liet, the field generator equipment is not working. I'm unable to mask us from proximity detectors. Can you repair it? Kynes asked. Not quickly. The parts, the man shrugged. Yes, Kynes said. Then we'll do without machinery. Get a hard pump for air out to the surface. Immediately. The man hurried away. Kynes turned back to Paul. You gave a good answer. Jessica marked the easy rumble of the man's voice. It was a royal voice, accustomed to command, and she had not missed the reference to him as Liet. Liet was the Fremen alter ego, the other face of the tame planetologist. We're most grateful for your help, Dr. Kynes, she said. We'll see, Kynes said. He nodded to one of his men. Spice coffee in my quarters, Shamir. At once, Liet, the man said. Kynes indicated an arched opening in a side wall of the chamber. If you please. Jessica allowed herself a regal nod before accepting. She saw Paul give a hand signal to Idaho, telling him to mount guard here. The passage, 2 paces deep, opened through a heavy door into a square office lighted by golden glow globes. Jessica passed her hand across the door as she entered, was startled to identify plasteel. Paul stepped 3 paces into the room, dropped his pack to the floor. He heard the door close behind him, studied the place, about 8 meters to his side, walls of natural rock, curry-colored, broken by metal filing cabinets on their right. A low desk with milk glass top shot full of yellow bubbles occupied the room's center. 4 suspense chairs ringed the desk. Kynes moved around Paul, held a chair for Jessica. She sat down, noting the way her son examined the room. Paul remained standing for another eye blink. A faint anomaly in the room's air currents told him there was a secret exit to their right behind the filing cabinets. Will you sit down, Paul Atreides? Kynes asked. How carefully he avoids my title, Paul thought, but he accepted the chair, remained silent while Kynes sat down. You sense that Arrakis could be a paradise, Kynes said. Yet, as you see, the Imperium sends here only its trained hatchetmen, its seekers after the spice. Paul held up his thumb with his ducal signet. Do you see this ring? Yes. Do you know its significance? Jessica turned sharply to stare at her son. Your father lies dead in the ruins of Arrakeen, Kynes said. You are technically the Duke. I'm a soldier of the Imperium, Paul said. Technically a hatchetman. Kynes' face darkened. Even if the Emperor Sardaukar standing over your father's body, the Sardaukar are one thing, the legal source of my authority is another, Paul said. Arrakis has its own way of determining who wears the mantle of authority, Kynes said. And Jessica, turning back to look at him, thought, there's steel in this man that no one has taken the temper out of, and with need of steel, Paul's doing a dangerous thing. Paul said, the Sardaukar and Arrakis are a measure of how much our beloved Emperor feared my father. Now I will give the Padishah Emperor reasons to fear the lad, Kynes said. There are things you don't. You will address me as sire or my lord, Paul said. Gently, Jessica thought. Kynes stared at Paul, and Jessica noted the glint of admiration in the planetologist's face, the touch of humour there. Sire, Kynes said. I am an embarrassment to the Emperor, Paul said. I am an embarrassment to all who would divide Arrakis as their spoil. As I live, I shall continue to be such an embarrassment that I stick in their throats and choke them to death. Words, Kynes said. Paul stared at him. Presently, Paul said. You have a legend of the Lisan al-Gaib here, the voice from the outer world, the one who will lead the Fremen to paradise. Your men have superstition, Kynes said. Perhaps, Paul agreed. Yet perhaps not. Superstitions sometimes have strange roots and stranger branchings. You have a plan, Kynes said. This much is obvious, sire. Could your Fremen provide me with proof positive that the Sardaukar are here in Harkonnen uniform? Quite likely. The Emperor will put a Harkonnen back in power here, Paul said. Perhaps even Beast Reban. Let him. Once he has involved himself beyond escaping his guilt, let the Emperor face the possibility of a bill of particulars laid before the Landsraad. Let him answer there, where... Paul, said Jessica. Granted that the Landsraad High Council accepts your case, Kynes said. There could be only one outcome. General warfare between the Imperium and the Great Houses. Chaos, Jessica said. But I'd present my case to the Emperor, Paul said, and give him an alternative to chaos. Jessica spoke in a dry tone. Blackmail? One of the tools of statecraft, as you've said yourself, Paul said, and Jessica heard the bitterness in his voice. The Emperor has no sons, only daughters. You'd aim for the throne? Jessica asked. The Emperor will not risk having the Imperium shattered by total war, Paul said. Planets blasted, disorder everywhere. He'll not risk that. This is a desperate gamble you propose, Kynes said. What do the great houses of the Landsraad fear most? Paul asked. They fear most what is happening here right now on Arrakis, the Sardaukar picking them off one by one. That's why there is a Landsraad. This is the glue of the Great Convention. Only in union do they match the Imperial forces. But this is what they fear, Paul said. Arrakis would become a rallying cry. Each of them would see himself in my father, cut out of the herd and killed. Kynes spoke to Jessica. Would his plan work? I'm no Mentat, Jessica said, but you are B'nai Gesserit. She shot a probing stare at him, said, His plan has good points and bad points, as any plan would at this stage. A plan depends as much upon execution as does upon concept. Law is the ultimate science, Paul quoted. Thus it reads above the Emperor's door. I propose to show him law, and I'm not sure I could trust the person who conceived this plan, Kynes said. Arrakis has its own plans that from the throne, Paul said. I could make a paradise of Arrakis if the wave of a hand. This is the coin I offer you for your support. Kynes stiffened. My loyalty's not for sale, sire. Paul stared across the desk at him, meeting the cold glare of those blue-veined blue eyes, studying the bearded face, the commanding appearance. A harsh smile touched Paul's lips, and he said, Well spoken. I apologize. Kynes met Paul's stare, and presently said, No Harkonnen ever admitted error. Perhaps you're not like them, Atreides. It could be a fault in their education, Paul said. You say you're not for sale, but I believe I've the coin you'll accept. For your loyalty, I offer my loyalty to you. Totally. My son has the Atreides sincerity, Jessica thought. He has that tremendous, almost naive honor, and what a powerful force that truly is. She saw that Paul's words had shaken Kynes. This is nonsense, Kynes said. You're just a boy, and I'm the Duke, Paul said. I'm an Atreides. No Atreides has ever broken such a bond. Kynes swallowed. When I say totally, Paul said, I mean without reservation. I would give my life for you. Sire, Kynes said, and the word was torn from him, but Jessica saw that he was not now speaking to a boy of 15, but to a man, to a superior. Now Kynes meant the word. In this moment he'd give his life for Paul, she thought. How did the Atreides accomplish this so quickly, so easily? I know you mean this, Kynes said. Yet the Harkon, the door behind Paul slammed open. He woke to see reeling violence, shouting, the clash of steel, wax-image faces grimacing at the passage. With his mother beside him, Paul leaped for the door, seeing Idaho blocking the passage, his blood-pitted eyes there visible through a shield blur, claw hands beyond him, arcs of steel chopping futilely at the shield. There was the orange fire mouth of a stunner repelled by the shield. Idaho's blades were through it all, flicking, red dripping from them. Then Kynes was beside Paul, and they threw their weight against the door. Paul had one last glimpse of Idaho standing against a swarm of Harkonnen uniforms, his jerking, controlled staggers, the black-goat hair with a red blossom of death in it. Then the door was closed and there came a snick as Kynes threw the bolts. I appear to have decided, Kynes said. Someone detected your machinery before it was shut down, Paul said. He pulled his mother away from the door, met the despair in her eyes. I should have suspected trouble when the coffee failed to arrive, Kynes said. You've a bolt hole out of here? Paul said. Shall we use it? Kynes took a deep breath, said, This door should hold for at least 20 minutes against all but a lasgun. They'll not use a lasgun for fear of shields on this side, Paul said. Those were Sardaukar and Harkonnen uniform, Jessica whispered. They could hear pounding at the door now, rhythmic blows. Kynes indicated the cabinets against the right-hand wall, said, This way. He crossed at the first cabinet, opened a drawer, manipulated the handle within it. The entire wall of cabinets swung open to expose the black mouth of a tunnel. This door also is plasteel, Kynes said. You were well prepared, Jessica said. We lived under the Harkonnens for 80 years, Kynes said. He herded them into the darkness, closed the door. In the sudden blackness, Jessica saw a luminous arrow on the floor ahead of her. Kyne's voice came from behind them. We'll separate here. This wall is tougher. It'll stand for at least an hour. Follow the arrows like that one on the floor. They'll be extinguished by your passage. They'll lead for a maze to another exit where I've secreted a thopter. There's a storm across the desert tonight. Your only hope is to run for that storm, dive into the top of it, ride with it. My people have done this in stealing thopters. If you stay high in the storm, you'll survive. What of you? Paul asked. I'll try to escape another way. If I'm captured, well, I'm still Imperial Planetologist. I can say I was your captive. Running like cowards, Paul thought, but how else can I live to revenge my father? He turned to face the door. Jessica heard him move, said, Duncan's dead, Paul. You saw the wound. You can do nothing for him. I'll take full payment for them all one day, Paul said. Not unless you hurry now, Kynes said. Paul felt the man's hand on his shoulder. Where will we meet, Kynes? Paul asked. I'll send the Fremen searching for you. The storm's path is known. Hurry now, and the Great Mother give you speed and luck. They heard him go, a scrambling in the blackness. Jessica found Paul's hand, pulling him gently. We must not get separated, she said. Yes. He followed her across the first arrow, seeing it go black as they touched it. Another arrow beckoned ahead. They crossed it, saw it extinguish itself, saw another arrow ahead. They were running now. Plans of him, plans of him, plans of him, plans, Jessica thought. Have you become part of someone else's plan now? The arrows led them around turnings, past side openings only dimly sensed in the faint luminescence. Their way slanted downward for a time, then up, ever up. They came finally to steps, rounded a corner, and were brought short by a glowing wall with a dark handle visible in its centre. Paul pressed the handle. The wall swung away from them. Light fled to reveal a rock-hewn cavern with an ornithopter squatting in its centre. A flat grey wall with a door sign on it loomed beyond the aircraft. Where did Kynes go? Jessica asked. He did what any good guerrilla leader would, Paul said. He separated us into two parties and arranged that he couldn't reveal where we are if he's captured. He won't really know. Paul drew her into the room, noting how their feet kicked up dust on the floor. No one's been here for a long time, he said. He seemed confident the Fremen could find us, she said. I share that confidence. Paul released her hand, crossed to the ornithopter's left door, opened it and secured his pack in the rear. This ship's proximity masked, he said. Instrument panel has remote door control, light control. 80 years under the Harkonnens taught them to be thorough. Jessica leaned against the craft's upper side, catching her breath. The Harkonnens will have a cowering force over this area, she said. They're not stupid. She considered her direction sense, pointed right. The storm we saw is that way. Paul nodded, fighting an abrupt reluctance to move. He knew its cause, but found no help in the knowledge. Somewhere this night he had passed a decision nexus into the deep unknown. He knew the time area surrounding them, but the here and now existed as a place of mystery. It was as though he had seen himself from a distance go out of sight down into a valley. Of the countless paths up out of that valley, some might carry a Paul Atreides back into sight, but many would not. The longer we wait, the better prepared they'll be, Jessica said. Get in and strap yourself down, he said. He joined her in the ornithopter, still wrestling with the thought that this was blind ground, unseen in any prescient vision, and he realized with an abrupt sense of shock that he had been giving more and more reliance to prescient memory, and it had weakened him for this particular emergency. If you rely only on your eyes, your other senses weaken. It was a Bene Gesserit axiom. He took it to himself now, promising never again to fall into that trap, if he lived through this. Paul fastened his safety harness, saw that his mother was secure, checked the aircraft. The wings were at full speed at rest, their delicate metal interleavings extended. He touched a retractor bar, watched the wings shorten for jet boost takeoff the way Gurney Halleck had taught him. The starter switch moved easily. Dials on the instrument panel came alive as the jet pods were armed. Turbines began their low hissing. Ready? He asked. Yes. He touched the remote control for lights. Darkness blanketed them. His hand was a shadow against the luminous dials as he tripped the remote door control. Grating sounded ahead of them. A cascade of sand swished away to silence. A dusty breeze touched Paul's cheeks. He closed his door, feeling the sudden pressure. A wide patch of dust-blurred stars framed in angular darkness appeared where the door wall had been. Starlight defined a shelf beyond, a suggestion of sand ripples. Paul depressed the glowing action sequence switch on his panel. The wing snapped back and down, hurling the thopter out of its nest. Power surged from the jet pods as the wings locked into lift altitude. Jessica let her hands ride lightly on the dual controls, feeling the sureness of her son's movements. She was frightened, yet exhilarated. Now Paul's training is our only hope, she thought, his youth and swiftness. Paul fed more power to the jet pods. The thopter banked, sinking them into their seats as the dark wall lifted against the stars ahead. He gave the craft more wing, more power. Another burst of lifting wing beats, and they came out over rocks, silver-frosted angles and outcroppings in the starlight. The dust-reddened second moon showed itself above the horizon to their right, defining the ribbon trail of the storm. Paul's hands danced over the controls. Wings snicked into beetle stubs. G-force pulled at their flesh as the craft came around in a tight bank. Jet flares behind us, Jessica said. I saw them. He slammed the power arm forward. Their fopter leaped like a frightened animal, surged southwest toward the storm and the great curve of desert. In the near distance, Paul saw scattered shadows telling where the line of rocks ended, the basement complex sinking beneath the dunes. Beyond stretched moonlit fingernail shadows, dunes diminishing one into another. And above the horizon climbed the flat immensity of the storm like a wall against the stars. Something jarred the fopter. Shell burst, Jessica gasped. They're using some kind of projectile weapon. She saw a sudden animal grin on Paul's face. They seem to be avoiding their las guns, he said. But we've no shields. Do they know that? Again the fopter shuddered. Paul twisted to peer back. Only one of them appears to be fast enough to keep up with us. He returned his attention to their course, watching the storm wall grow high in front of them. It loomed like a tangible solid. Projectile launchers, rockets, all the ancient weaponry. That's one thing we'll give the Fremen. Paul whispered. The storm, Jessica said. Hadn't you better turn? What about the ship behind us? He's pulling up. Now! Paul stubbed the wings, banked hard left into the deceptively slow boiling of the storm wall, felt his cheeks pull in the G-force. They appeared to glide into a slow clouding of dust that grew heavier and heavier until it blotted out the desert and the moon. The aircraft became a long horizontal whisper of darkness, lighted only by the green luminosity of the instrument panel. Through Jessica's mind flashed all the warnings about such storms, that they cut metal like butter, etched flesh to bone, and ate away the bones. She felt the buffeting of dust-blanketed wind. It twisted them as Paul fought the controls. She saw him chop the power, felt the ship buck. The metal around them hissed and trembled. Sand, Jessica shouted. She saw the negative shake of his head in the light from the panel. Not much sand this high. But she could feel them sinking deeper into the maelstrom. Paul sent the wings to their full soaring length, heard them creak of the strain. He kept his eyes fixed on the instruments, gliding by instinct, fighting for altitude. The sound of their passage diminished. The fopter began rolling off to the left. Paul focused on the glowing globe within the attitude curve, fought his craft back to level flight. Jessica had the eerie feeling that they were standing still, that all motion was external. A vague tan flowing against the windows, a rumbling hiss reminded her of the powers around them. Winds to 700 or 800 kilometers an hour, she thought. Adrenaline edginess gnawed at her. I must not fear, she told herself, mouthing the words of the Bene Gesserit litany. Fear is the mind killer. Slowly her long years of training prevailed. Calmness returned. We have the tiger by the tail, Paul whispered. We can't go down, can't land, and I don't think I can lift us out of this. We'll have to ride it out. Calmness drained out of her. Jessica felt her teeth chattering. Clamped them together, then she heard Paul's voice, low and controlled, reciting the litany. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. When it has gone past me, I will turn to see fear's path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain.